Margaret Dawson was not born a killer. Life had made her one. Her father had been a cruel man. He wasn't just strict, he was monstrous. A drinker. A violent man with a heavy hand and a sharper tongue. But his worst crime wasn't the beatings. It was the nights he came into her room, whispering that she was special, that no one else could love her the way he did. By the time Margaret was 15, she had lost all faith in men. She saw them as destroyers, monsters in disguise. She vowed never to bring another one into the world. But life had other plans. At 21, Margaret married a kind, soft-spoken man named Daniel Dawson. He was everything her father wasn't: gentle, patient, loving. She convinced herself she could love him. She convinced herself she could heal. When she became pregnant, she was hopeful. A child could be a fresh start. A clean slate. But when the ultrasound revealed it was a boy, something inside her cracked. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend she was happy. But when she held the baby in her arms for the first time, all she could see was the face of a future predator. A man in the making. That night, she sat in the dim glow of the nursery, cradling the infant. She whispered apologies as she pressed a pillow over his tiny face, waiting for the struggling to stop. The next morning, she screamed and wailed, pretending to discover his lifeless body. The doctors called it SIDS. Everyone pitied her. Margaret felt nothing but relief. 2 years later, she was pregnant again. Another boy. Another silent death. By the time her third son was born 5 years later, Margaret had perfected her act. She let him live for a few months, cooing and cradling him in public, but when the time came, she poured a lethal dose of sleeping pills into his formula. Daniel was devastated. His eyes grew dull, his body frail. He begged Margaret for another child. He didn't understand why this kept happening, why fate was so cruel. Margaret did. And she would never tell him. Her daughters, Lisa and Emily, were 10 and 6 when Margaret became pregnant for the 4th time. She had hoped for another girl. But the doctor's voice crushed that hope with 2 words. "It's a boy." Margaret's smile was practiced by then. She had become an expert at hiding her true emotions. She kissed her husband's cheek, pretended to be excited. But inside, she was planning. Lisa was old enough now to sense something was off. She had spent years watching her mother grieve over her lost brothers, but something about it never felt real. It was like Margaret wore a mask that only slipped when she thought no one was watching. And Lisa was always watching. When Henry was born, Margaret waited. She let a few months pass. Then, on a cold October night, she decided it was time. Margaret moved silently through the darkened house. Daniel was snoring in their bedroom. Lisa and Emily were asleep down the hall. The house was still. She crept into the nursery, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the crib. Henry lay there, peaceful, oblivious. She pressed the pillow over his face. But before she could finish, Margaret's blood ran cold. She turned sharply. Lisa stood in the doorway, her face pale as a ghost, her 12-year-old hands trembling. "Mom?" Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" Margaret froze. Lisa took a step forward. Her wide eyes darted to Henry's tiny, struggling body beneath the pillow. A scream tore from her throat. Margaret lunged, clamping a hand over Lisa's mouth. "Shoo, shhh, sweetheart," she whispered desperately. "You don't understand. He would grow up to be just like..." Lisa bit down on her mother's hand, hard. Margaret yelped, pulling back. Lisa bolted down the hall, her bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. Emily woke up. The neighbors heard the screams. And then, sirens. the trial was a media sensation. A mother who had killed 3 of her own sons and was caught attempting a 4th? The world wanted blood. Lisa testified against her mother. Her voice shook, but she told the truth. Daniel sat in the courtroom, hollow and broken. He couldn't comprehend it, how the woman he loved had done something so monstrous. Psychologists examined Margaret, peeling back the layers of her trauma. They spoke of her father's abuse, of her fear, of how her twisted mind had justified murder. But in the end, none of it mattered. She was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder. Sentenced to life in prison. As the judge read the verdict, Margaret turned to Lisa. Her daughter's eyes were cold. And in that moment, Margaret realized Lisa was no longer her little girl. Lisa was her judge. Her executioner. Her survivor. Lisa and Emily went to live with their aunt, far away from the house where their mother's crimes had taken place. For years, Lisa would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the sound of her mother's whisper in the nursery. "You don't understand." But she did understand. And she would never forget.